Hi, everyone. My name is Jim McCafferty. Welcome to CrimCon 2020. This is stream 3 for Wednesday. The panel name is Innovative Approaches to Studying Crime and Delinquency. We have 4 presentations. We're going to go in order of the program. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A button at the very bottom. Please type your questions there. We're going to save them to the very end, and we're going to try to give everybody their 10 minutes. And we're going to start with Justin from the University of North Alabama. So take it away, Justin.
How y'all doing today? Today, my paper is going to be an investigation into the relationship between facets of psychopathy, neurological functioning as it relates to the decision to join gangs for juveniles. So juvenile gang involvement is associated with delinquency, violent victimization, and mental health problems. The extant literature suggests that youth gang membership is associated with negative outcomes, such as lower socioeconomic status, lower educational attainment, poor general health, family issues, and life course criminality all the way into adulthood. Considering the short and long-term consequences associated with gang involvement, it is imperative practitioners and researchers expand their knowledge for variables related to the decision to join a gang. So the literature between the constructs remain unclear because studies have observed mixed results for psychopathy and gang membership. This lack of understanding is exacerbated by studies relying on all male samples or failing to disaggregate females from mostly male samples. Previous research examining the dimensions of psychopathy across sex suggests differences in behavior expression and evidence that has established a relationship between neurological dysfunction and general delinquency, which is also associated with youth gang membership. In previous studies have also noticed that there are sex differences in neuromaturation, and research on neuroanatomical and functional connectivity between male and female psychopaths are mixed. So risk factors consistently identified for gang membership amongst boys and girls are low socioeconomic status, substance abuse, deviant beliefs, neighborhood dysfunction, age, violence exposure, low empathy, peer delinquency, family adversity, family structure, race, and prior deviance. However, the salience of these factors differs across sex, with girls reporting more victimization experiences and fear, while boys often cite monetary and recreational reasons, as well as neighborhood structure and dynamics as motivations for joining gangs. The identification of risk factors allows scholars to increase their understanding of the variables associated with gang membership. However, without comprehending the gang recruitment process, interpreting the role of these variables will lack a contextual understandings for boys and girls. So the recruitment evidence over the recruitment process has found that for boys and girls, this process can be extremely gendered, with girls expected to engage in sexual initiation, while boys are evaluated on their perceived toughness, delinquent versatility, violent propensity, and ability to follow orders. Studies have observed that the perceived promiscuity, sexual orientation, established relationship with male gang members and gang type influences the agency for female gang membership. Some other factors influencing reporting is some scholars have suggested that due to shame, lack of support, and objectification associated with sexual initiation by girls, that these girls are actually less likely to be honest in their reporting about the sexual victimization experience during the recruitment or initiation process. So previous investigation has provided support for psychopathy as well as a multidimensional construct. The interpersonal affective dimension of psychopathy is representative of psychopathy's core features, such as lack of empathy, low guilt, shallow affect, disregard for performance. The socially deviant dimension involves chronic criminality, sensation seeking, parasitic lifestyle, delinquency, criminal versatility, impulsivity, and lack of forethought. Such differences for the facets of psychopathy relate to have observed as it relates to youth gang membership. There's been differences in sexual behavior, aggression, emotional dysregulation, violence, and childhood trauma. As it relates to psychopathic traits and neurological dysfunction, the evidence is mixed. Some studies have um, found reduced gray matter volumes in the orbitofrontal cortex, hippocampal cortex, and temporal lobes in the male and females. While other studies have found diminished insular volume in females and opposite for males. Other studies have also found bilateral anterior insula and the inferior frontal gyrus was associated with the development of callous unemotional traits in boys, and studies investigating um, el- electrophramic, um, electrographic, and psychopathic samples have observed differences in sex for wave activity in the bilateral frontal lobe, basal ganglia, parietal areas, and paralimbic system. Although this evidence is still mixed, overall, most studies observe neurological differences in psychopathic males and females. However, some investigation is needed to disentangle this relationship. Therefore, the current study wants to test two main overarching hypotheses and has one research question. Oops, sorry, not moving at the same pace. The first hypothesis is to test after looking at everything that I expect to find that the socially deviant dimension would positively be associated with gang membership for girls. And I expect both dimensions of psychopathy would be positively associated with gang membership for boys. And a research question that's being investigated is, does neurological dysfunction predict youth gang membership due to due to the fact that I'm not actually able to do an fMRI study and actually identify which areas of the brain may be associated with this decision-making process. This study is only going to investigate using what are they called? The Stroop's test and and the trail making test, which are both markers for evaluating for operationalized neurological dysfunction, and to see if any form of neurological dysfunction is related to the decision to join gangs in boys and girls. So the data used is going to be the pathways desistance study. We're going to use the baseline level of the sample because that is the one, only the trail making task and the Stroop task are available at the baseline. Two, only the psychopathic checklist youth version is available at the baseline. So all the core independent variables are only available at the baseline, which is why only the baseline will be used for this data. And the first thing we're going to do is actually separate the data set into male and female only. So it is going to be a separate male analysis and a separate female analysis. And I'm going to do a bivariate analysis where correlation is performed to investigate the relationship between facets of psychopathy, neurological functioning, and youth gang membership. And I'm going to perform a multivariate analysis, just a logistic regression to examine the probability of success versus failure for youth gang membership between dimensions of psychopathy and neurological dysfunction. The independent variable, how much time left?
You have just over 2 minutes. I was going to give you the 2-minute warning in about 20 seconds.
Thank you. So I told y'all about these. So gang membership is operationalized using the self-reported items. Have you ever been in a gang, which is coded 0, which is dichotomously coded, And also go back to if respondents responded that they were in a gang 6 months prior, and actually check it and cross verify across the groups. I noticed that some would say they were in a gang 6 months prior, but then would respond that they, have not ever been in the gang. So I will recode those to 1 to get as much accuracy as possible. The control variables for the study is exposure to violence, neighborhood conditions, association with deviant peers, possession deviant beliefs, and demographic variables such as race, socioeconomic status, and age. And this is the sample. Let me get to the results. So what we're seeing now is that the key things to notice is that we are seeing that the interpersonal affective dimension and the socially deviant lifestyle dimension of psychopathy is positively associated with gang membership for females. The interpersonal affective dimension is also associated with control variables for gang membership, such as deviant beliefs, violence witnessed, peer delinquency, maternal hostility. We are seeing that this is also, wrong one. And for males, we're seeing the same thing. That's just associated with the same variables, specifically the interpersonal and socially deviant lifestyles dimension. All right. And so what we actually found once we do the logistic regression is that we actually see that once controlling for all the influence, the only variables that are significantly predictive of gang membership are neighborhood, well, that's not that's actually less, but violent victimization for females, peer delinquency for females, and a socially deviant lifestyle dimension for females. As for males, what we see is that race, deviant beliefs, violent victimization, socioeconomic status, peer delinquency is associated with gang membership. Although the interpersonal dimension landed at 0.052, typically less than 0.05 is what you would say for significance. And so that's why I has that little cross right there. It was just like right over the threshold, but only one independent variable was predictive.
Okay, Justin, I'm sorry, we have to move on to Eleanor now.
That's fine.
Thank you, though. Yep. If you would unshare your screen so Eleanor can share hers. Eleanor, if you would unmute yourself and share your screen, and I will start your clock.
Right, hi, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
And can you see anything yet apart from me?
Yes, I can see I can see a PowerPoint here.
But it's got quite small, hasn't it? There you go, is that bigger? It's better. Right, hopefully. Hi, I'm Eleanor, and I wanted to talk to you about censoring music and looking at sexism and racism in suppressing and criminalizing music. And my interest in music as a subject for criminological study goes back a long way. So I was born and brought up in a part of England called the Black Country, and it's next to Birmingham. And some of you might realise there's a significance in Birmingham as being well, we like to think we invented heavy metal. So, and references to heavy metal in academia quite often represent it in ways that I didn't recognise in the way that I experienced it myself in a metal community. And it's, quite often denigrated, seen as something that, scruffy working class kids are into, particularly in Britain. And of course, it's been at the centre of debates about censorship for a long time, and it's banned or suppressed in a number of countries. So there are problems with performing and listening to heavy metal in countries like Russia, China, and Malaysia. And even if people aren't violating specific laws. There's certainly the erosion of people's rights in terms of freedom and autonomy. The United Nations has had a special rapporteur in the field of cultural studies since 2009, which highlights the importance of human rights in artistic expression and freedom. And music can reflect more about problematic social arrangements. It's not just really about entertainment. But when music has perceived negative consequences, then censorship can be one of the perceived answers. And what we can find is that law can regulate and discipline popular culture, and there is power issues at play in what music is labelled as deviant, and by doing so, that can lead to an erosion of liberty. So, as I say, there's been a long history of this, particularly in the United States. You know, so the less than democratic countries, you might think, oh, well, that makes some sense that they are, you know, very censorship prone. But and these cases may be familiar, but you know, Ozzy Osbourne was sued in a US court over his song "Suicide Solution," which is actually about alcoholism. But it was accused of encouraging suicide. Judas Priest were accused of suicide-inducing hidden messages on their album Defenders of the Faith. The Columbine shooters had been alleged to be Marilyn Manson fans, and he suffered a decline in airplay, and he recently said that it had destroyed his career. Obviously, you're probably aware of the PMRC musical hearings, and in that it was said by Susan Baker, the wife of the then Treasury Secretary James Baker, that she said some rock artists seem to actually encourage teen suicide. Ozzy Osbourne sings Suicide Solution, Blue Oyster Cult sing Don't Fear the Reaper, AC/DC sing Shoot to Thrill, and just last week in Centerpoint, a small Texas town, a young man took his life while listening to the music of AC/DC. He was not the first. And obviously the point is that she misunderstands the lyrics in some of these songs, and then posits a causal connection between being a fan of heavy metal and harming yourself or harming others. And bringing this up to the current date, one of the reasons for my interest in this is you will see here, hopefully, some news headlines from British newspapers. So we have the London Evening Standard, obviously that's a newspaper for London, and the Telegraph, which is a countrywide newspaper. We have a scene called the UK drill scene. And drill music, as some of you may be aware, comes from originally from Chicago, but it has had a kind of massive resurgence in the UK, and it has been seen to be causing a lot of gang warfare. And Cressida Dick, who is the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London, has singled drill music out as having a terrible effect on gang violence. The police have been very keen to prevent drill music. They have asked for many videos to be removed from YouTube. And this is obviously the major way in which many of these artists will be performing and exchanging their music, particularly given coronavirus and there's no live music. But videos have been disrupted by the police. And lyrics have been used in court to prove, you know, ill will and a sort of a kind of action that they are going to take, even though they are just song lyrics. So the artists are censored, their music's removed, and this has a kind of racist element to it, really, because in London especially, there was a form that the Metropolitan Police would ask venues to complete. And this was about having a license to be able to put a gig, a concert on. And it was called Form 696. And the promoter of the event originally had to say what race of people would be most likely to be attending this particular event. Obviously, that was, highly prejudicial. And so once the police decided that they would remove this, so they didn't have to ask what kind of people would be appearing at this, they then asked what kind of music it was. And there's an overarching term called urban music, which is a contested term, but it quite often tended to refer to predominantly black forms of music, such as grime, Afro beats, bashment. And so basically, this caused a lot of problems in people getting gigs. And so this was a very direct discrimination. The form was only the form was only got rid of last year following the intervention of the London mayor. And as I say, the idea that music can be violent, misogynistic, responsible for violence and death, goes back a long way. But as I say, the forms of music that are identified are usually very particular types. And I just wanted to flag up another area in which there is problems for certain artists. And this is in the issue of female artists in certain parts of the world. And there is an organisation called Free Muse, and they are a human rights-based organisation who advocate for the freedom and for artistic expression. And they find that lots of female artists can be marginalised in certain countries, mainly because of hardline religious interpretations of indecency, and perhaps in countries where there are strong patriarchal traditions. And there's some artists here on this slide, Ariana Saeed, who received a number of death threats.
Eleanor, I'm sorry to interrupt. You have 2 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. So she received a number of death threats because her outfits were seen to be an affront to Afghan culture. Layla Amar was expelled from the Musicians Union in Egypt following a music video, and you cannot perform in Egypt if you are not part of the Musicians Union. And even in Thailand, the Prime Minister got involved in saying that this one particular artist, Lu Mai Hai, her clothes and her dancing were inappropriate. And when you've got the Prime Minister talking about you, I guess you've probably made some impact there. I'm starting to look at the issue of Me Too within the music industry as well. There has been some movement around this. You can see here that the women's participation in the music industry is actually very small. You can see here from the UK top songs, there were more women with top songs in the UK in 2008 than there were in 2018. And to be fair, in the Billboard charts, there really wasn't a huge amount of women artists either. So the participation of women is low. There's also the issue of sexual abuse and harm coming to female artists, as well as women who attend music gigs. So I'm just going to wrap that up. It's been a very quick run through all of this, but I wanted to just present an idea of looking at something quite ordinary like music and how it can work for a criminological study.
Fascinating, Eleanor. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. If you would unshare your screen, we're going to invite Tim to the floor now.
All right. Should be shared and ready to go now, I believe.
Go for it.
All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. I will be discussing some research, part of a larger project I've been working on for the past several years, and I'll be presenting on the digital disclosure of delinquency. And there's a couple of research questions that are going to drive what I'm going to discuss today. And the first one is, does social media affect delinquent peer influence? And this is something, again, I've been looking at the past several years. I looked at this through my graduate studies and then through subsequent work on a school safety project that I'll talk about here in a few minutes. And you'll see that this question has only been partially answered by me and other researchers. There's some tricky methodological issues that make this type of research really quite complex. And as a criminologist who has been trying to wrap his head around peer delinquency and cyber communication, I realized that I forgot to ask a pretty important first question. At least maybe I asked it a little bit later than I should have. And that is, do kids talk about illegal activities while communicating online? I took this as a bit of an assumption based off of my own experiences with social media and the emerging research coming out in the 2000s and 2010. But today I explore this in more detail, and it's perhaps where I should have started to begin with. So I'm going to share some pretty interesting descriptive findings. And I thought I would actually start with that, one of my most interesting descriptive findings. In a bit, I'll talk about how this came from a survey of over 2,500 students across 6 school districts. And in this survey, we asked middle and high school kids, if you did something illegal and you wanted to talk to somebody about it, would you do it online or in person? And we provided a 7-point scale in which they indicated if they prefer online to in-person communication. And this is what I found. Most youth, about 2 out of 3, prefer talking in person about their delinquency or about illegal activities that they have engaged in. And about 9% of my respondents prefer talking online exclusively. And about 25% reported they really had no preference for how they disclose their delinquency. So we could take these together to assume about 1/3 of respondents are willing to talk about their delinquency online. That is that 9% who preferred and the 25% who really have no preference. But I really want to draw your attention to like the top left of that figure, on the 66% of youth who say they prefer disclosing their illegal activities in person. In fact, about 44% of my sample will only talk in person about their delinquency, and just about 4% will only talk online. And I think it's really interesting and great when we can ask one question in a survey that gives us such rich information. And the key takeaway from this that I'm going to come back to at the end of my presentation is that kids still prefer offline communication. That is where most of the delinquent peer influence mechanisms are taking place. There is evidence of an online effect, but it's weak and it's only for a small portion of youth. And again, I'm going to draw on some prior work in addition to what I'm adding to today. Now, when I started this line of thinking, I went back to Sutherland and I reread the original text on peer influence and delinquency and social learning. And I started asking myself, okay, what's changed? What's new? What's different? Many of us were familiar with the process of differential association, and by which criminal behavior is learned. And according to Sutherland, it has everything to do with communication. And after reading again through the cyber literature, the psychological literature, I began asking, what has affected delinquent peer influence? There's new opportunities to interact and to communicate, but what does this mean? And what else are we missing as researchers? And in my prior work and prior conferences and writings, I suggest there are 3 ways that technology has influenced communication. I'm going to focus on number 3 mostly today. The first one is about how the internet creates a new context of online-only peers who are not normally interacted with offline. So it's a type of context. We can think of it that way. The second point ties into Sutherland's modalities of association, that through social media, we're able to have more frequent contact with our friends. It endures for longer periods of time, and sometimes we can have more intimate interactions with our peers. And then finally, it influences the self-disclosure of personal information. I don't have a lot of time to go into the depth here, but there's a lot of research to suggest that kids act and say things differently when they're on a smartphone or on a computer. Research shows that kids are disinhibited when online. Now, this ties into total anonymity and social anonymity. Total anonymity is what we were talking about maybe 20, 25 years ago. It's the idea where you don't know who it is on the other end of the chat room or the computer. You don't know who that person is. Social anonymity ties into how you feel anonymous because there's lack of social cues. You don't make eye contact. You can't see, shrugging shoulders, that sort of thing. There's other factors that come into play here, like de-individuation and perceptions of responsibility. When you're online, you may not feel responsible for aggressive or hateful things you say because the internet it appears limitless. There's hundreds, millions of people out there. So I can kind of come back to this and unpack it a little bit more. But there's reasons to believe kids say and do things online that is different from how they interact in person. Now, why we should care about this as criminologists? Well, I think some of this is pretty intuitive in terms of peer influence, but a couple things I want to briefly highlight. And the first is the idea that smartphones have narrowed the digital divide, whereby those in the lower class have access to the internet and social media. However, we do not all use the internet the same way. And there's been some work on what's called the digital divide, which is observed in many communities. And it explains how Black and Latino youth are more likely to use social media than their white counterparts, but the way they interact online reflects lived experiences with inequality and lack of opportunity. And this is from the work of Watkins et al. And as a criminologist, I was really concerned and fascinated by this because I was questioning, what is being discussed among those who are most likely to discuss or to use online communication. And I will direct you to some further reading on the digital street and the code of the street, which explains how online depictions of violence can have multiple meanings. Kids may portray themselves online as appearing tough and ready for violence, but this might be a mechanism for avoiding violence in the street. Much like Anderson's code of the street, this might be more prominent in disadvantaged communities of color. And I'll just add in right now, I'm married to a public defender, and I have seen many examples of prosecutors using social media evidence as indicators of criminality, but we should really be cognizant they can have multiple meanings. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, and unfortunately, my research can't really do as much as I want to with this topic. But what I can talk about today is, again, kind of the first steps of this, and that is how are kids talking online? What are they disclosing online, and how has this been enhanced or changed because of social media? So I'm going to fly through the data and methods, but I'm happy to elaborate if you have questions. The data come from the UMSL Comprehensive School Safety Initiative. This is a longitudinal study on the causes and consequences of school violence. We obtained consent from about 3,700 7th and 8th graders back in 2017. These students were across 12 middle schools and 6 school districts in St. Louis County. I'm going to focus on the second and third waves of the survey today because we added in some additional questions on online influence. And about 75% of respondents at wave 3 who had consent completed the survey. For demographics, 45% white, 45% male, 43% white, 37% Black, and then at wave 3, all students were in 9th and 10th grade. So some descriptive findings before I talked about or tried to get at this idea of talking about illegal activities online. I wanted to understand what are kids doing with social media. So again, this is on wave 3. These respondents are in 9th and 10th grade. 14% prefer communicating online rather than offline. About a third of respondents say it's easier for them to make friends online compared to offline. And about a quarter of respondents report that most or all of their online friends have never been met in person. So what we can assume from this is about a quarter of respondents have online networks that are mostly all online. There's not significant integration between their online and offline network. So a sizable portion of kids rely on social media, whether that's through primary communication or for finding friends online, but not most youth. Again, about 25% have that online only kind of network. About 28%.
You have about 2 minutes to go.
All right, sounds good. About 28% report discovering friends' illegal activities online rather than in person. I'm not going to unpack this in a lot of detail, but this is really perhaps opportunity. Kids find out about their peer delinquency online first rather than in person. So we saw that for about 28% of kids. And then the last 2 points there are ones I already mentioned kind of in that first slide. About a third are willing to discuss illegal activities and 9% prefer to discuss online. To summarize my multiple regression models, I use an ordinal logistic regression to predict the preferences for in-person to online disclosure. I was really curious if criminogenic risk factors are associated with online disclosure, things like peer delinquency, street code, techniques of neutralization. What I found was that mostly, by and large, there's not a lot of criminogenic risk factors associated with online disclosure. Males and those who are impulsive are more likely to prefer disclosing online, as well as those who like to talk online. not a shocker. Those who prefer offline disclosure are more likely to be Black, have more integration between offline and online networks. They have a high degree of school commitment, parental attachment, pro-social peers, that is those social bonds that act as mechanisms of control, thinking back to Hershey, but they're also associated with some criminogenic risk factors such as violent neutralizations and adherence to the street code. So in conclusion, again, there is a sizable portion of kids who are willing to talk about delinquency online, but very few really prefer to do that. And it's not really associated with a lot of those criminogenic risk factors. Now, I did estimate models predicting delinquency and substance use, looking at the online peer disclosure variable that I didn't really talk a lot about today. And what I just want to highlight is that the association for the traditional kind of offline peer delinquency is about 4 to 8 times stronger than offline, than the online counterpart. I looked at race and gender conditioning effects, not much going on there, nothing for gender, really small, nothing for race, really small gender effect where the effects were stronger for males. Overall, I think we have a lot to learn about online disclosure and how this supplements and reinforces what takes place offline. We really need mixed methods to be able to tackle some of these research questions. Pretty limited on what I could do in a survey, but I think this is pretty interesting, and I am really curious on working with others and trying to expand this research and this line of thinking. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. If you would unshare your screen, and we are going to give the floor to the last group from U of L. I believe we have Yvonne giving his presentation here.
Let's see. Can you all hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
All righty. Let me see. Let me get my screen share going. All right. You should be able to see that now. Is that right?
I see it. If you're ready, I'll start your clock, man.
All righty. Yeah, I'm ready. So let's get it started. Good morning. I'm going to present our paper on behalf of the team. My name is Yvonne Benitez. Our paper deals with school resource officers and how behavioral management strategies might shape SRO roles. Just a quick brief on what SROs are. So according to the National Association of School Resource Officers, SROs are sworn law enforcement officers who have the duty to the power to arrest, but are also placed in school settings. Now, under their triad model, they're perceived as having 3 particular roles. This includes the law enforcement role, a mentor role, and a teacher role as well. And so one particular reason as to why we should investigate more on school resource officers and their roles is because the research has generally shown that which role that officers engage in, that typically leads to different student outcomes. For example, schools whose SROs act more as law enforcement officers typically have more exclusionary outcomes for students, but also tend to report more offenses to the police as well, compared to schools whose SROs act as mentors, where they typically have more positive relationships with students. So a little bit of research has also examined how context might shape SRO roles. For example, one study in particular looked at how schools with a higher disadvantage affected SROs, and what they found was that a greater disadvantage in schools led to more of a law enforcement officer role rather than a non-law enforcement officer role. However, that's about all of the research that has been done on how context might shape SROs. And so this is where we kind of go into our ideas, which I will present to you here in a second. But this research in particular is important right now, specifically with all the the nationwide calls for defunding the police. So this research is kind of beneficial for schools who have either already decided to, keep or remove, but also for schools who are in the midst of deciding whether they should keep their SRO programs or not. So a little bit on the literature review. Most of the research on community context with policing has shown that there are some structural characteristics that shape policing behavior. For example, neighborhoods who have a higher disadvantage, typically are policed more often, as well as communities who have a higher concentration of minorities. And so we have the idea that this might also overlap with police and schools as well, given that schools are seen as a community, but also that SROs are police as well. As far as the security measures, the research has shown that schools that use more security measures creates a culture of control for students. So this is where schools focus more on student discipline rather than educating the students themselves. Similarly, exclusionary practices have the resemblance of broken windows policing or zero tolerance policing. And this is seen where schools use exclusionary practices for minor offenses like students being tardy. On the other hand, schools who have more restorative practices, they actually tend to have more positive student outcomes. So they also tend to have a more cohesive student body. So what we suspect is that these behavioral management strategies might shape SRO roles, and which, as I mentioned earlier, which lead to different student outcomes. So our study is basically, driven by three particular research questions. So what is the relationship between security measures and SRO roles, exclusionary practices and SRO roles, and lastly, restorative practices and SRO roles. So the data that we use for the current study comes from the 2015 and 2016 school survey on crime and safety. And this survey generally asks questions on school security measures, student safety measures, as well as the roles that SROs take. And one thing about this data set is that it is a nationally representative data set. So it comes from roughly 4,800 schools. And in this particular data set, 2,096 respondents completed the survey, but we're more interested in schools who actually reported having SROs. So this brought our sample size down to 1,360. So kind of going briefly into the dependent variable, what we did was to create the SRO role, we ran an exploratory factor analysis and a confirmatory factor analysis. And what this is basically creating a latent variables. And what we found was findings consistent with Nazaro's triad model, where there are three particular SRO roles. For example, the first one being the mentor, which consists of roles such as SROs being involved in school discipline, solving problems, or reporting problems, but also being involved with student mentoring. The second role we found was the law enforcement officer role, which consists of SROs being involved in traffic control, patrolling schools, but also being involved with emergency personnel. And lastly, the teacher role we found was consistent with, again, the triad model, but was more in line with teaching students on law-related courses, legal definitions, but also prevention training. For the independent variables, what we did was we ran an item response theory modeling, and it's also another type of a latent variable. And what it does is it runs discrimination and difficulty parameters to find variables that are measuring a particular construct. In the first one, we were measuring security measures. So what we did was we ran the analysis with 24 variables and found that 10 items of those 24 were actually measuring a security measure construct. In the same fashion, we did that for restorative practices, and we found that of the 10 variables, 9 of those variables were measuring restorative practices. And a quick brief on the security measure variables, they typically consisted of variables such as, there being strict dress codes, there being random searches for contraband, students walking through metal detectors, and also students wearing student ID badges. And for the restorative practices, it mostly consisted of like behavioral management strategies, but also social emotional learning and student involvement in restorative practice. The last for independent variable, we created it by, which is the exclusionary and disciplinary practices. We created it by dividing the total number of student incidences, and we divided that by the total number of student offenses. This gave us a proportionate variable, which kind of essentially measured the likelihood that schools would use an exclusionary practice relative to the number of offenses they have. And to kind of accommodate for the several latent variables that we used, we ran the analysis using structural equation modeling. And this was done through Stata and M+. In the paper that we actually wrote up, we have 4 models and they're each building on each other. But for the sake of time, we're only presenting on models 1 and 4. But I do want to point out that model 1, there's no controls. The second one controls for school composition and size. The third one controls for crime near the school, but also schools' SRO policies. And lastly, the fourth and final model controls for school misconduct as well. Just some brief limitations before we go into the full findings. We do acknowledge that there are potentially opportunities for measurement error. For example, our main dependent variable, the data comes from school administrators and not SRO roles or SROs. So there might be some overlap there.
Hey,
But
Vaughn,
also,
sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you know you got about 2 minutes.
alrighty, sounds good. So the secondly, the reliance on SRO binary variables. So essentially, we can't really measure how often SROs are involved in a particular role. And lastly, that the data is cross-sectional. So yeah, here we have models 1 and 2. Models 1 and 4. And as you can see on the x-axis, we have the different SRO roles, and on the y-axis, we have the standardized coefficients. The black arrows indicate that there's a significant relationship. So for example, in model 1, we can see that security measures predicted all 3 SRO roles, whereas the restorative practices only predicted the mentor role. And lastly, that exclusionary practices predicted the law enforcement and teacher role. Now, we did expect the security measure to predict the law enforcement role, and we expected the restorative practices to predict the mentor role. The other ones were less expected, but they were, still significant, so we reported on them. After controlling for all the, the school composition and size, school misconduct, SRO policies, we found that restorative practices remained a predictor of the mentor role. Again, consistent with with what we expected, but a little bit less unexpectedly, we found that security measures predicted the SRO roles or the teacher role, and we suspect that this might be due to the variables regarding the teacher. And as you recall, they related to more teaching law-related courses and legal definitions. So maybe an environment that has security measures might create a perception that SROs must educate students on these kinds of on that kind of stuff. So to wrap it up, basically we found partial support for ecological theories that context, in a sense, shapes individual behavior, and particularly here, school context shaping SRO behavior. And while this is useful, we still find that that it's kind of our voice, using our voice to kind of like call for ending the carceral continuum. So as we see that that school context shapes behavior, so maybe the school should consider that how their context shapes SRO roles. One way to kind of like maybe solve indifferences between schools and SROs are MOUs. However, these are just written up contracts, but there's no empirical evidence that suggests that that they're entirely foolproof. Another way of having a better outcome with SROs is involving the community. And lastly, just once SROs have served their goal, basically find a plan of how do we get them out of schools. And that's all I have for you all. Let me unshare my screen.
Thanks, Yvonne. That was great. We are out of time, unfortunately, for the panel. And I didn't see any Q&A come through here. So I just want to say a few words before we wrap it up. First, I want to thank all of the panelists for a great session. There were 4 great presentations today, and I appreciate all of your work. Just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you that are either presenting on this stream in the next panel or want to attend the next panel on this stream. We're actually ending each stream for about 5 minutes, and it's a way for us to housekeep everything, but then also give the hosts a break for about 5 minutes each hour. So I'm going to end the stream in a moment, and I'll be back at 10:55. But I just want to, end by saying again, thank you to everybody. Thank you for everybody for your time, and I hope you enjoyed CrimCon. I'll see you in a few minutes.
Thanks, James. Thanks.